Today we refer to Viking Age Scandinavians, broadly as the Vikings, as if they were one people. The fact is that the historical group known as the understand that at the beginning of the Viking Age, no one identified themselves as Swedes, Danes, or Norwegians, belonging to a country. Instead, they identified themselves by their specific region of origin. For example, according to the Annals of Angoulême and the Annals of Saint Bertin, the Norwegian group who sacked the city of Nantes in 843 called themselves Vestfoldinki, which means men of Vestfold, and not Norwegians. Mostly, the primary sources we have on the Vikings and their culture are histories written by Christian and Muslim scholars, talking about heathen or pagan Vikings, creating a very much two-dimensional view of them. An example of this is how Muslim chroniclers clearly views this through the cultural and religious lens of Islam, and we see the same tendencies from the Christian writers. The historian Al-Yaqubi, in his study of the Mediterranean, linked the Scandinavians from Sweden, known as the Rus, to those from Denmark who sacked Seville in 844, saying it was carried out by the Magus, who are called the Rus. His view was that they had similarities between them, but he also didn't understand their differences. And in the account we have from Ibn Fadlan, it says that there were few differences between the Rus and the Danes. One notable thing was that the Rus were covered in blue tattoos, which is not something that comes up in the Western chronicles about the Danes and the Norwegians. And it's also noted that the Danes and Rus could talk to each other with ease, something Scandinavians also can today. So what were the differences between the Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish Vikings? Let's find out. The Swedes, then known as Varangians, or Rus, stayed true to their pagan ways for the longest out of the three, only becoming Christian in the late 11th century. The Swedes' most important city during the Viking Age was Birka, founded by one of the early Swedish kings and situated in Lake Mälaren, close to the modern capital Stockholm, which ultimately connects to the Baltic Sea. And it was from here they started to spread down the rivers of Volga and Dnieper, in modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, reaching as far as Constantinople, Damascus, and Baghdad, where they traded, raided, and even became the personal guards of the Eastern Roman Emperor, called the Varangian Guard. They established long trade routes to the Middle East and around the Black Sea and avoided other places, until the late 9th century when, according to the Russian primary chronicle, the brothers Rurik, Sinius, and Truvor were invited by the Slavs to be their rulers. Why and how this event occurred is unclear, but most historians believe this was a capitulation by the Slavs after years of raids. The name Rus comes from an Old Norse word meaning the men who row. The earliest sources mentioning the Rus come from the beginning and middle of the 9th century from Byzantium, Persia, and France. All of them describe the Slavs and the Rus as two distinct groups, with the Rus dominating the Slavs. But later, the chronicle doesn't distinguish between the Slavs and the Rus to the same degree, meaning that the Swedish Vikings seems to have assimilated quickly, much like the Vikings did in Normandy, where they spoke French and adopted French customs and traditions within a generation. They were excellent explorers and tradesmen, but simply not as violent as the other types of Vikings. I'm speaking in relative terms here. They terrorized many along the Baltic. And this is something many people misunderstand about the Vikings and how they operated. The Vikings didn't necessarily go out to either trade or plunder. They were pragmatic and were open for both, of course. This depended on what the Vikings believed would be the smartest and most profitable way to proceed. If the forces they were up against were stronger than them, or if they knew that an attack on a place would spawn a strong military reprisal, they would of course not attack. They were opportunistic, smart, and just as cunning as their god Loki. Other things that seemed to be unique to the Swedes were their grooming habits. Their coloring of their faces with blue paint, among other details, stands in contrast to the Danes and Norwegians. Something the Frankish chronicler Rimbert also recounts after his travel to Sweden, where he describes the unusual and shocking religious rituals of the Swedes at Uppsala, including human sacrifice. However, how different they were from their Danish and Norwegian cousins from a cultural and spiritual standpoint is still debated among historians. It is hard to say anything for sure, as the sources in question have disagreements that undermine their credibility. Swedes ultimately held on to the Viking lifestyle the longest and was the last of the 3 Scandinavian kingdoms to abandon the Old Norse gods and convert to Christianity. Even though the Swedes mostly operated in the east, they also journeyed and conquered land and riches in England, France, Spain, and Italy. The Viking Age began with raids on a Christian monastery in 791 and in 793 at Lindisfarne. These raids, that started the Viking era, are believed to have been done by Norwegian Vikings, but like many things about the Viking world, we cannot say this for sure. The uniting of Norway to a single country supposedly happened in 872 by Harald Finehair, but most historians agree that his domain didn't include some parts of central and northern Norway. The first king to rule the entire Norway was a Dane, Canute the Great, but Norway was then a part of the great Nordic Empire he had created, and Norway as a single country with only one king didn't happen until Magnus the Good became king in 1035 AD. The reason for the late unification was that Norway was a very difficult country to rule. It has steep cliffs, deep fjords, waterfalls, and huge mountain ranges that you need to negotiate in order to reach people. And Norwegians have always been a fiercely independent people, feeling strong connections to their local community, rather than to a king that lives hundreds of miles away. The succession to the throne system is an important key to understand the political development in Norway during the Viking Age. In Norway, the main rule was that all sons of former kings could inherit the kingship. The rule of succession meant that several kings could rule at the same time. This was an important cause of strife and conflict between various congregations and their followers. Norway is therefore the country with the most unrest internally, with several civil wars happening during the Viking Age. And the Norwegians didn't discriminate who they attacked. They didn't care if you were the same people as them, and terrorized the Danes, Swedes, and other Norwegians with their attacks and raids. The Norwegian Vikings were utterly crazy warriors and was considered to be the bravest, craziest, and most badass. The archaeological evidence suggests that most of the Vikings who used axes